Hi, I'm Alan Hedblum. Welcome to our show, a place to feel like you belong. During our conversation, you'll notice words and phrases appearing at the bottom of the screen. After our dialogue, stay tuned for a follow-up segment called What'd You Say?, where we will explain some difficult slang and cultural concepts that you heard during the conversation. A complete list will be given on our website for the conversation with today's date. For now, I'd like to welcome today's guest, Richard Yidana, Associate Professor of Sociology at Grand Valley State University. Richard, thanks for coming by and joining us today.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah. So you were born and grew up in northern Ghana.
Yes.
In the northern state.
Yes.
And something happened that didn't allow you to continue your studies, your university studies in Ghana. Can you tell us that story?
Yeah, my father became a political prisoner. There was a change in government in Ghana in the 1980s, and as a result of that, my father was swept up in those political changes, and he became a political prisoner for about 10 to 12 years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And his job with the government before, the official government?
Yes, he worked as a chief superintendent of police. He retired as a commissioner of CID, which is the FBI equivalent of the British police rankings.
Mm-hmm.
So.
And it took some effort to get him out. Yes,
Amnesty International got involved, and as a result of their activities, he was released subsequently.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Now, I noticed in your bio that you were, for a time, the faculty advisor on campus for the Amnesty International group.
Yes.
What kinds of things do you tell your students, or the students in the organization?
One of the things I tell them is that one has to find a principle, an issue in which you believe in, and pursue it with a principled approach to life, and then act accordingly. The issue, there's a lot of people in the world who speak about human problems but do nothing about them. So some of the advice I gave them was to be able to draw this connection between their own moral and social ideals that they acquire about what it means to be human, and then act accordingly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Sure. So you were offered a scholarship to come study in Boston.
Yes, in Worcester, Massachusetts.
Oh, okay.
Yes,
okay.
yes.
In Massachusetts.
Clark University in Worcester, Massachusetts.
Okay,
yes.
okay, good, good. And I was just listening recently to an interview on maybe NPR or Terry Gross. There was a Nigerian author, Chimamanda Adichie.
Yeah, okay.
And I don't know if you've seen her
I'm familiar
book.
with some of her work, not the last one.
Okay, yeah, called Americana.
Yes, I'm familiar
and
with
she
it.
talked, the setting is in the US and then back in West Africa, and then it's a novel.
Yeah.
But it takes place back and forth, and in preparing for our conversation today, it made me wonder if you may have shared some experiences. In particular, she talked about coming to the United States and having some very strange experience with African Americans. She was stopped or greeted on the street by an African American who said, "Hey, what's happening, sister?" Well, she got indignant because you're not my brother, we're not related.
Yeah.
So there's this cultural, assumptions and familiarity and happening in both directions that was really confusing. Do you have some stories from those early days about your own identity and awareness as an African coming in and interacting? Because in a sense, in Ghana, there's identity is simpler, and in the US, it's a very complex issue.
Yes, in a sense it is. I tend to go the other direction from Ngozi. That's what I call her. That's one of her names. I think the complexity of one's experience depends upon where you come from in sub-Saharan Africa. In some parts of Africa, identity is simple. In other parts, it's complex. The issue of being called a brother by an African American here or a sister by an African American here and being surprised by it or taken aback by it is more a function of somebody growing up in a social system in which social identity is not framed by race. but rather by ethnicity. So in sub-Saharan Africa, I'm most likely going to experience any kind of discrimination in the form of ethnic discrimination, more so than anything else, rather than race. And so when you come to the US, where race factors in the ways in which, or ethnicity of late, of course, factors in the ways in which one's identity is defined, then the complexity becomes much, much more glaring.
And for our viewers, ethnicity is something we could describe as something, a tribal identity.
A tribal identity, although I move away from the word tribe, because it comes with a very Eurocentric meaning and content.
Sure.
So I prefer the word ethnic group or nation, whichever way you go.
Sure.
But yes, for viewership purposes, tribe would be a temporary compromise.
And sometimes we conflate race and ethnicity, and in fact, race is a made-up concept.
Race is a made-up concept, but because it has concrete social consequences, it does take on social meanings. Yeah.
With a long history.
Exactly.
In the United States.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, do you have a story from that time of coming as a young African to the United States and interacting with African Americans?
Yes, I didn't have difficulty interacting at the intellectual level. The difficulty was social. Mm-hmm. And it very often had to do with interpersonal relationships. For example, dating a white lady was something that was taken to be anathema or a taboo among the African Americans. And in fact, as an undergraduate, I wrote an article in the school newspaper called Strangers of Our Race. And the basic argument of that article was to say that blackness is really not a phenotype, it's not a color, it's an idea. And people relate to the idea based on their circumstances.
Mm-hmm. When we were talking earlier, you had said that America is a paradox.
Yes, for me it is.
Can you elaborate?
Let me use technological metaphors. Think of the computer that has a hard drive, and the hard drive has memory, and the memory is what we call software. So even though one makes the journey from Africa to the United States, you still have to negotiate which aspects of that memory you're willing to empty and which aspects you're willing to replace, because you can't empty the whole hard drive and replace it with just American memory. So it is a struggle in that sense, and for me, that's part of the paradox. The other paradox is that it availed to me, or it gave to me, a lot of opportunity to go to school from an undergraduate to PhD, virtually funded by the universities. But because of that education, I also see some of the contradictions of American democracy. I see some of the contradictions of race relations.
Can you give us some examples?
One example would be during the war in Iraq, right? I could understand, I could read the movement and figure out that this wasn't really about democracy per se. It wasn't really about the spread of democracy per se, because if it was, some of our actions, for example, American intervention in Iran, actually helped to overthrow one of the most democratically elected leaders in the history of Iran, Mossadegh, in 1954. This was a coup that was masterminded by the CIA. But at the same time, I'm also aware that in American society, the reason the contradictions are more glaring is because the freedoms here are much more deeper and greater.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. How does this awareness on your part play out in your education of American students? Because they're growing up with a certain mindset.
Yes. By the time we get them in college, one of the most difficult things to do as a professor is to convince a student to keep an open mind. They come to college already with a worldview, already with a mindset.
Often of their parents.
Exactly, or the social context, not just parents, but and the narrative of American history textbooks, what they are taught in high school, and the like, and the like, and the like. So it's very, very difficult to then take such a student and say, you need to think outside the box, you need to think differently. So what I do, and I think most of my colleagues do, is to recognize that this is a very contentious process, but it's a necessary contention. It's a necessary conflict to generate, because without that conflict, they do not embrace the necessity of thinking critically.
There's no growth.
Exactly.
Yeah, sure. So now, I think when we spoke, you had just had a recent visit to back to Ghana.
Yes.
So you have family there.
Yes.
You have a job here.
Yes.
Okay. Where is your home? This program is about belonging.
Yeah.
So where do you belong?
I belong to both. I belong to both. My emotional and psychological memory is very, very Ghanaian. So even though I've been here for 22 years, there's still a lot of the food here that I cannot eat. I still have to explain my jokes to people. When I tell a joke, I have to spend under 5 minutes explaining the joke. So there are some things. I'm not just a biological entity. My body carries with it a history, it carries with it a culture, it carries with it ethics, morality, most of which were framed whilst I grew up in Africa. But at the same time, I'm older as an American than I was an African, in the sense that I'm 43 now, but 22 years of those 43 years have been spent in the United States. So at the very least, the chemicals in the food that I eat here makes me an American. So my identity is not a simple one, not at all. And because I think that we still haven't figured out what terminology to give to people like myself. Because when I go back home, the home that I left is no longer the same. When I come back here, I'm not totally assimilated into the system either. So we need to rethink both intellectually and culturally what kind of identity we want to give to people like me. The word immigrant is a political word, it's not cultural. So I prefer something else, perhaps a member of the new diaspora, whatever you want to call it. But immigrant for me doesn't do enough to capture some of the cultural, social, political, and even economic struggles that I go through as an American. So I think I straddle both worlds. Yes. Yeah.
And we were talking about that earlier. You had mentioned diaspora and diaspora conversations.
Yeah.
Some people define home in terms of activity.
Yeah.
But from when we were talking, a lot of your definition is about relationship, is about interaction.
Yes.
And so when I heard you talking about it, it was about the Jamaican restaurant,
yes,
the East African restaurant,
yes,
and associations.
Yes.
And actually, you had, as I think of it, you had one really poignant story that if we can wrap up with this.
Yeah.
Talking about relationship, you had a student come to you with an unusual request.
Yeah. Okay. In my social problems class, I taught a student called Jeff, and after the first lecture, he walks up to me and he says, "I think you get along with my mother very, very well. Her name is Anne, and she lives in Jennison." And so I agreed to meet the mother, and in a very, very interesting way, we actually just hit it off right from the onset, and we become very good friends now. But the reason I was able to connect to Anne was at the human level. It wasn't even about that she's from Jennison or Detroit or she's an American, but it's just that she exhibited to me the human qualities that I want to see in human relationships. And that's really what drew the connection between me and Anne in Jennison.
Okay.
Yeah.
So for you, home and belonging is a sense of relatedness,
yes,
and connecting at this very elemental level.
Yes, for me, home is not just a physical place. It's also an emotional place.
Awesome.
Yes.
I wish we had more time. This has flown by, absolutely. So we'll have to continue this more off camera. But
Yes.
I want to thank you so much for joining us today
No problem.
in the studio. And for our viewers, Please join us in a few moments when we'll be back for our segment called What'd You Say? Swept up means to be taken against one's will by a large, powerful force. In this case, Richard's father was swept up and sent to prison when the government of the country changed suddenly. Amnesty International is a non-governmental organization which speaks up against human rights abuses across the globe. In the case of Richard's father, Amnesty International worked behind the scenes to free him a dozen years after he was imprisoned. There's good news and bad news in New York State. The bad news: numbers of volunteer firefighters are dropping across the state. The good news: in some towns, the opposite is happening because of the increase in immigrants. According to the Firemen's Association of the State of New York, immigrants from Central and South America are stepping up to volunteer. Port Chester Second Assistant Chief Mike DiVittorio called this wave of immigrants a godsend. The department's numbers are growing because of dozens of Latinos who are joining the force. The 2010 census showed 59% of Port Chester's residents were Latino or Hispanic, with 45% foreign-born. Village trustee Luis Marino is the first Latino to hold public office there. He's happy getting involved, bringing in younger guys who also want to serve, immigrants from Ecuador, El Salvador, and Guatemala. Each day we're growing, he said, and just to kid the natives, Marino sometimes adds, we're going to take over. For locals who are faced with a house on fire, I'm sure that's just fine with them. For more details on this story, visit the What's Up section of our website at feellikeyouBelong.com. For all you science students in the audience, you know that the work of genetics is to mix different kinds of characteristics to see what happens. For example, a cross between a horse and a donkey results in a mule. If you breed a poodle with a Labrador, you get a Labradoodle. This principle of mixing or crossing two breeds is at the heart of a particular kind of American riddle. Certain kinds of jokes have a format that Americans will recognize, and in this case, if you begin by saying, "What do you get if you cross?" they will understand immediately that this is a riddle, and they can either try to guess the answer, or if they have no idea, they will say, "I don't know," or "I give up." Here's an example. What do you get if you cross an elephant with a rhino? Give up? Elephino. Now, if you didn't understand the joke, there will be an explanation on our website under the section, What's So Funny? There, you will also find some of my favorite jokes that begin, what do you get if you cross? That's all for now. I hope soon you can start laughing along with your American friends.